Welcome to The Backstory. I'm your host, Anne Hancock-Toomey. Over the course of my career, I've had the privilege to work with and learn from and guide some incredible leaders, mostly in healthcare, but not always. The Backstory is a chance for me to talk to some of them, unpack who they are and where they came from, and how it all influences who they are today and how they lead. Ultimately, each conversation offers a case study in what I'm calling authentic leadership. Let me now invite you into our conversation for the real backstory. Today, I have the great pleasure of spending time with Mike Wiechart, who's currently president of professional clinical staffing company TEAMHealth and a longtime executive leader in healthcare. He is someone I've known for a long time, and I've been really looking forward to this. Welcome to the podcast, Mike.
Well, thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
So, Mike, you and I worked together for many years ago when you were building a hospital company that was based here in Nashville called Capella. So this is like 10, 15 years ago.
Correct.
And through that, I got to know you as a leader and also as a person. And as I think back to our work together, I remember fondly time on the road with you, meeting with employees and physicians and community leaders of the hospitals and the communities that you served at the time. And you were always so patient and thoughtful. You were serious when you needed to be, but you also have a great sense of humor. And I've always admired your leadership style. I've always admired that you were a great listener and an even better problem solver, but that's probably because you're a great listener. And so when I launched this podcast about strong leaders who are inspiring and get results because of who they are and the environment that they create, I thought of you.
That's flattering. Thank you.
And you're a big UK basketball fan and a lot of fun to hang out with too. So here we are.
The biggest UK basketball fan.
You are. We're going to talk a little bit about that. I know there is so much for us to learn from your now 35-year career in healthcare and your overall story, just being a human trying to make a positive impact in this crazy world, which is all any of us are trying to do. So if you're ready, I'd love to dig into your backstory.
Let's do it.
All right. Well, let's start from the beginning. Now, I know you are from a tiny town originally. Tell me about where you're from and how you grew up.
It is a tiny town. I grew up in a rural community, very rural, in Northwest Ohio. I say it's a town of 50,000. I describe it as 45,000 acres of corn and 5,000 people taking care of the corn.
I can picture it.
Big farming community, big German Catholic enclave. Everybody knew everybody in town, and the vast majority of my family still lives up there. Extended family still lives in that community. It exists on the outer fringes of kind of the Rust Belt area. Everybody who worked there basically was in three vocations. You were either in auto or heavy manufacturing industry, you did farming, or you did healthcare. That was it.
Well, so did you know which of those three things you wanted to do?
No, I didn't. Actually, what I really wanted to be was a priest.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Between my eighth grade year and going into my freshman year, explored that track by attending a couple kind of priest seminary experiences and opted not to go into the priesthood. Much to my grandma's, and God rest her soul, broke her heart. She just knew I was going to be a priest. So.
Oh, man. I would imagine that comes into play maybe later in your career in different ways.
It does. It does, for sure.
Very good. What was your first job?
My first, I would say, real job was working in a kitchen in a family-owned pizza joint in Battle Creek, Michigan. I was not very good at it. One of the perks of the job was you got to eat as much pizza as you wanted while you were working.
Uh-huh.
They eventually let me go. 6 months in, I think I was a loss leader, where I was probably eating more than I was actually producing. But no, in reality, I did get let go. But one time I sent out a pizza without cutting the pizza for takeout.
Oh, no.
The customer complained, and it was actually owned by my girlfriend's father. So it was a tough conversation. He goes, "This might not be your thing." That was my first experience with attention to detail.
Yeah.
And accountability in the workplace.
I bet.
It's good.
Very good. talk to me about the first leader that you can remember who impacted you in a positive way.
As I look back on my career, I would tell you, I know for a fact that just because of positive circumstances, good fortune, luck, my life's collided into a lot of great leaders. I've just found myself falling into the right people at the right times my entire career. I've really been blessed in that way. But there was one leader, the first person I actually worked for in a professional setting. Her name was Gail, and she was the controller of a small hospital not too far from where you went to school in Statesville, North Carolina, who took me under her wing in my first job as a staff accountant and really taught me what it meant to be a professional. And not really a leader, because at that point you're not really thinking about that. But I had no idea what it meant to be a professional. She was competent, she was caring, compassionate, and she was the hardest worker I had ever been around, probably even to this day. I was at a point in my life where I was pretty malleable. I was very subject to being influenced. And if I had been connected to a wrong person, I probably went the wrong way. But I got connected to her, and she just trained me up, and we continue to be friends to this day.
I love that.
And eventually she worked for me a couple times, which was...
Full circle.
Yeah.
So what does it mean to be a professional? What did Gail teach you?
I think my views on that probably evolve as you progress in your career. At that time, for me, it was dedication to the job, following through on commitments, living the part, if you will, both in the workplace and outside. You don't get to basically take off the jacket and be something else outside. And then just having a core competency in what you do and being basically capable in a role.
I love it. Okay, so did you grow up all the way through high school in that little tiny town in Ohio?
No, my dad worked in manufacturing and got transferred to a community in southwest Michigan, Battle Creek, Michigan. It was a tough move, but a good move at the time.
So I know that you went to the esteemed University of Kentucky. How did you get from Michigan to Kentucky?
I was determined to go to Michigan State. And my dad was in the middle of getting transferred again, but this time to Georgetown, Kentucky. And he said, basically struck a bargain. He said, you can come down and be with us, and we will help you a little bit, or you're on your own. And I literally, the day school started at the University of Kentucky, I drove down that day, enrolled in classes, very begrudgingly, by the way. I hated the idea of it. But as you know...
Best decision you ever made.
Second best. My wife, who I met at Kentucky, by the way. But yeah, it was the best decision that ever happened to me.
So what was your first job out of college?
First job was an accounting job, almost by accident. I was bouncing around general studies, and I met my wife at UK. And the only thing I knew at the time is that I wanted to get married to this person.
Yeah.
And she had basically one condition. I had to have a real job, not even though I worked full-time while I was in school. And I remember going to my advisor at Kentucky in the business school, who I met for the first time in my 5th year. And I said, look, I've loved it here, but I probably need to be moving on. What degree am I closest to at this point? I said, I looked at all my stuff and said, you're not going to believe this, but you're about 9 hours away from an accounting degree. And I said, by golly, that's what I'll be.
I did not know this about you. The fact that you just backed into your career.
Literally just backed into it. Motivated by a girl to get married.
Good decision.
Oh, yeah. Everything worked out fine, but there was some good fortune in all that.
That's fantastic. Okay, so what was your first job in healthcare?
So it was in a hospital working as a staff accountant. Okay. And for that person, Gail, that I mentioned, my job was just to basically assist on all the things that you would ascribe to the fundamentals of running the back office functions of a typical hospital. Great learning experience.
And you were hooked on healthcare, that is.
Yes, that was the point where I realized circumstance might move into a vocation where I wanted or needed to be into something that contributed to the well-being or the needs of others. Tangential as that was, right? Given I wasn't actually taking care of patients, but I was around it all the time. And it started to mean something to me about that time.
And then your career really took off in hospital operations and management. You were named as CFO of a hospital when you were 26. Is that
26
right?
years old, yeah.
26 years old. So how steep was that learning curve? And I'm really curious, do you remember people discounting you? You were very young to be at that C-suite table.
I can tell you've done your homework. Yeah. Yeah, I was so far over my head at 26 or my skis doing that. Yeah, I remember the vast majority of people that reported to me in that first role were twice my age.
Yeah.
And veterans, there's a huge credibility gap right there, right out of the jump. And I had to overcome that. I had to learn to exist in it, had to learn to overcome it, and then had to learn to build trust, essentially by being genuine and authentic. And I was lucky to be around people that gave me a measure of grace as I was starting to learn how to be a leader at the time.
Yeah. Did you ever find yourself trying to appear older or more experienced than you actually were at that time?
My inclination is to say no, but rationally, probably yes.
Yeah.
I think that's human nature. When you're in that situation, you're trying to measure up to the role. But I've always tried to be an authentic and genuine person, so I didn't know how to play the role. So I don't know if it was intentional, but I'm betting unintentionally. People probably observing me saying this guy's trying to act like he's in his mid-30s and doing this, but he's not.
Well, I asked the question because when we launched this firm, I was 26.
Wow.
And I was in a lot of boardrooms with people twice my age who were very seasoned. And I found myself also trying to gain credibility and trust as I was advising. And I remember David Gerard telling me, you are in that room for a reason because the folks around that table have more seasoning and experience in life and in business and in other things, but they're going through something very specific in this moment in time, and you've actually done it many more times than they have. It's a merger, or it's an acquisition, or it's a crisis, or it's some sort of event that you can actually guide them through in that moment. But I can remember those dynamics, and I was just curious if you felt the same way.
Yeah, and I think as I think about it, not being sure you belong in the position or in that moment probably was the motivation I needed to actually be successful in it. So yeah.
Very good. Okay, so those early days in your hospital operations and hospital management, you were with HCA at that time, is that right?
So I initially started with HCA, and I think it might have been like 2 weeks later they sold to Health Trust or spun out Health Trust.
Okay.
And yeah, I was at Health Trust in that first CFO role.
Okay. And then from HCA, you spun out with some other colleagues to found Lifepoint.
Correct.
Is that right?
Yep.
So you were an entrepreneur for the first time.
Indirectly, yeah.
Yes.
I mean, nobody asked me if I wanted to go there. But yeah, I was recruited into the spin-out Lifepoint at the time, and I was glad to have an opportunity to do it.
Yeah. What do you remember about those days? What did you love? What was the challenge of building something?
Yeah, that was a special time for me in terms of learning to be a leader, learning to be an entrepreneur, simply because the deck was stacked against us at the time. Small rural hospital company spun out from big HCA. I think we had 24 hospitals when we first started. For many of us, that was our first kind of you're on your own kind of thing.
Yeah.
You're not standing behind a big company like Health Trust or HCA. And the way that initial team came together in those early days, I've been looking to recreate that culture and that moment my entire career since then. We were led by an extremely dynamic, very young leader at the time, Scott Mercy. I know you know the story. It was just my best friends in the world are people I experienced work with at the time.
For those that are listening, they may not know that story. Are you willing to talk about that a little bit? Okay. Talk about that very tragic event and how it impacted you.
There was actually two tragedies that kind of coalesced the organization back then in the early days of Lifepoint. But for those who do know, Scott Mercy, incredibly talented, dynamic young leader whose family was involved in the early founding of HCA and had a history there. And I don't think it's a stretch to say most people recognize that Scott was effectively earmarked to eventually be leading HCA, even at that age, at 35. So he was tasked with basically being the CEO of taking Lifepoint out of HCA at the time. And he took me under his wing too. He's probably mid-30s and I was 28, 29 at the time, but he was so much more seasoned and experienced than I was. And I spent a lot of time, but the story you're referring to obviously is Scott was a pilot, was training to be a pilot. Mm-hmm. Almost on the anniversary of Lifepoint spinning out from HCA, Scott tragically died in an airplane accident here in Middle Tennessee, which was remarkably traumatic for all of us on multiple levels, most of all losing a friend that we loved. But we're a new company with the guy who was basically on point to take us out, and he wasn't there anymore. Mm-hmm. It made us all wonder what was going to happen next. We were fortunate that behind Scott was another great leader by the name Jim Fleetwood. He was the antithesis of Scott. Scott was young, dynamic. Jim was old and curmudgeonly, but a great human being that understood the hospital from the loading dock all the way to the ORs. But it was a pivot. It was a change in style, and Jim took over and gave us something completely different, but also very needed at the time. And then tragically, he passed away almost 1 year later from a heart attack as he was out sailing his boat for the first time.
My goodness.
So within 2 years of spinning out from HCA, this upstart company, we were faced with 2 tragic CEO turnovers within 24 months. That was part of that coalescing and us against the world stuff.
Yeah. You probably grew up overnight.
Yeah. At this point, I was starting to come into my, I would call it professional maturity out of necessity. But yeah, those moments, you make quantum leaps in professional identity, maturity, and understanding what you can overcome under adverse circumstances.
Mm-hmm. So tell me, from that point forward, you were with Lifepoint for how long?
10 years, almost 10 years.
10 years. I would also imagine that you made the shift from being a leader of great professionals to being a leader of leaders.
I use that term all the time.
Do you?
I do.
I swear I didn't know that. That's cool.
I literally use that term all the time in describing changing roles when I do evaluations with people, that you're no longer a leader of contracts or things, you're a leader of leaders.
Yeah.
And that's a different thing.
It is a different dynamic. Share a little bit about your perspective on that. What does it take to be a successful leader of leaders?
It's that pivot, right, out of maybe achieving results out of sheer will and effort on your own regard. Doing things, leaning in, putting your shoulder to it and doing your own work, to now realizing that you can't possibly do the work yourself. And what you really need to do is assemble around you people who are probably better than you. Give them the green light to go out and be successful, and at the same time hold them accountable for results.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure that lesson has served you well as you moved from Lifepoint then over to Capella.
Correct.
In 2009.
2009.
As COO. I think that's when we first met. And I know you were COO for some time and then ascended to the CEO position. How was the job of COO different than being a CEO?
If I was to contrast those two particular roles at that time, when I came into Capella as COO, it was still early in Capella's formation. Mm-hmm. So when I was brought in Capella as COO, the focus at that time was really just putting basically the nuts and bolts in place, establishing kind of the operating rhythm and cadence and nature, and what's going to be the operating identity of the organization moving forward. Then you move into the CEO role, and the company was in a different place at the time, a little more mature. It was time to figure out a direction for the company. And so I had to, basically set aside the operational stuff that you would typically do or associate with a COO role and focus on mapping a strategic direction for the company, and to do it pretty quickly.
That's a big challenge. And so the challenge, I think, for any CEO really is the dual role, or the two hats that you wear, I guess, of managing up to a board, or in your case, a board that included private equity investors, right? And also leading a mission-driven group of people to perform well on every metric, right? Talk a little bit about that duality and sometimes that tension.
First of all, I'd back them. So I was really fortunate that the private equity sponsor owner at the time offered two things of incredible value to the organization and then by extension to me in the role, which was they were very patient with what was transpiring within the company at the time. And they were very experienced in the world of healthcare. But you're right, there was this thing at the moment, which was how do you move a struggling company on a path to success, but do that in a way that doesn't abandon the culture, the underlying core mission of what we were doing, which was in Capella before I got there, and it was grounded in the founders at the time. So as you know, you were there with me, we spent a lot of time grassrooting and working with the people in the field and going through a lot of conversations, and I guess I would call it listening tours.
Yeah, it's pretty critical.
Yeah.
And you were able to find the right home for Capella and Regional Care, which acquired Capella in...
Regional Care and Capella merged in 2016.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I seem to recall at that time you sharing with me that you were done.
I was done.
And you were going to go maybe on the road with the boys in blue and go to the beach and spend time with your family. And then lo and behold, you ended up running another successful, large, growing healthcare company in TEAMHealth. How did that happen?
I thought I was mostly done. I wasn't fully done, but I would say semi-retired. But I failed miserably at it. I'm not very good at golf. I can't catch a fish to save my life. I mean, I think it was around 2017, early 2017. I got a call from TEAMHealth, Leif Murphy and Blackstone, about joining them as COO of TEAMHealth. Blackstone had just acquired TEAMHealth in November 2016, I think.
Okay.
And so Leif had just joined them as CEO. He recruited me off the couch.
What was it about that opportunity that attracted you?
Well, I had a lot of reservations on the front end, actually. I haven't spent my entire career in the health system side.
Yeah.
I viewed the business model that TEAMHealth was about and is about today as a very transactional vendor kind of thing, and sensed it might be a little too disconnected from the missional purposes that kept me in healthcare for as long as it did. I worried about that going into it. But what attracted me to the job was the chance to work with Leif Murphy. I held him in extremely high regard and have not been disappointed in that.
And describe TEAMHealth today, for those who don't know it.
TEAMHealth we're largely known as an emergency medicine staffing company, but it's so much more than that. It's a professional services staffing company that offers the full gamut of all hospital-based services, whether that's emergency medicine, hospital medicine, anesthesia. Also happens to be the largest post-acute clinical practice in the country.
I did not know.
By a wide margin.
Wow.
I don't think there's anybody even close.
Yeah.
Probably
Wow.
in 1 out of 5 hospitals out there providing care.
That's amazing. Congrats on your success there over the
Thank you.
last 8 years or so.
A little over 7, going on 8 years.
7 years.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so Mike, as you look back on all of your career, I know we've just scratched the surface on so many of these amazing chapters. What's the accomplishment you're most proud of?
You didn't ask it this way, but the greatest accomplishment is my daughters and watching them grow and find their own path and purpose in life. It's far more rewarding than anything I've personally done, but to put it in a professional context, which is where I think you were coming from, not so much me, but something I got a chance to be part of. And I suspect my story is probably a lot like a lot of other people's, which is in the early days of the pandemic, the wheels were coming off. Nobody knew what was happening at the time. And I'll never forget getting a call. It was in maybe the second week of February. This is before this started becoming to the collective consciousness. People started to really understand what was happening. And I was told by some folks who were connected to the CDC that what's about to happen is something that only happens once every 100 years or so. Nobody is prepared for what's about to happen. I was floored, grappling with the reality of that.
Yeah.
Because if you think about what TEAMHealth is and what we do, we're at the front lines. And so everybody knows what happened next. March comes, start to have the shutdowns, care in the hospital bifurcates. All the elective stuff that basically keeps the entire health system basically solvent goes away overnight.
Yeah.
On the other side of that is this mad rush of COVID-related disease that nobody knows how to take care of. And we were at the front lines of it. And we were coming out in 2019 at the time, the best year in TEAMHealth's history. Actually starting to fire on all cylinders organizationally. And within 4 months, everything changed. We went from going from the best year in TEAMHealth's history to, not an exaggeration, losing $100 million in the month of April.
Wow.
Staring down a reality, it was a pathway towards insolvency because we didn't know what was going to happen next. This is the part that's responsive to your question. I remember having calls every week. It was always focused first on the clinical response. But then we had this second level calls about how are we going to stay solvent through all this. And that call turned into how are we going to take care of our clinicians who are taking care of the nation right now. And we made a decision that we were essentially going to backstop 70% of the compensation that our clinicians have historically experienced, no matter what happened next.
Wow.
It was an incredible leap of faith.
Sure.
We drew down the revolver, every last nickel we can get on the credit card. Our partners at Blackstone threw money into the kitty and said, focus on two things. Take care of the clinicians and let them take care of the nation.
Wow.
I experienced a lot of heroic moments, again, vicariously in my type of role around me, but I'd never been around something like that where I was sitting in the epicenter of some pretty significant and heady decision-making that was dealing with life and death on one hand and existential nature of a company on the other hand. And then making a principled decision to say, we're going to focus on taking care of the nation and our clinicians. And we came through it fine. But we did not know that at the time, and we still made the right decision.
Yes, you did. A leap of faith, but it turned out to be the right decision.
I think even if it had gone wrong,
it still would have been the right decision.
It was the right decision.
That's terrific. Okay, Mike, let's talk also about mistakes, because every leader makes them. Every human makes them, of course. Can you recall over the years any mistakes that stand out to you that really affected you, caused you to grow professionally?
One profound experience or a thing where I wish I had a do-over impacted me, not just professionally, but personally. It's a pretty involved thing, and I would show on the front end, it's not necessarily a happy ending kind of story. And this is all about the human side of leadership, if you will. More of a learning experience than a mistake. It was about 10 years ago. I received a inbound message on a professional social media site from a former female colleague that I hadn't worked with for 10 years prior to that time. The inbound email was a fairly unremarkable and innocuous email. How you doing? Think about you often. Always enjoyed your leadership and the chance to work with you, and would love to catch up sometime. We all get those all the time.
Sure.
I responded back, as I expect most of us would have, which is detached and socially superficial world we live in today, and just said, hey, great to hear from you. Hope you're doing well. Would love to catch up. Let's connect soon. Now, at the time when I wrote that, I probably did have intentions about at some point we might connect, but I wasn't intentional about actually following up. And so here's the part of the learning experience where the story takes not necessarily a happy turn, which is I found out 2 weeks later through a mutual friend that person had taken their own life.
Oh, man.
And in the process left behind 2 teenage children and a husband. And when I got the news, it absolutely devastated me.
Yeah.
Caused a real crisis of conscience and had me questioning everything I thought about myself in terms of how I look after people, not just in the moment, but I've experienced over my career and my life. Because I have been given a platform to do that.
Yeah.
It changed everything for me. As I sit here today, I don't know that had I been more intentional and reached back out, that things might have turned out differently. But to me, that's the whole point.
Yeah.
I don't know. And it was clear that at the time, this wasn't networking for a job. This was somebody dealing with something and was looking for a friend, busy with my own things and burdened by my own concerns. I actually missed the opportunity to be that friend. So I decided then that I was going to change how I related to people moving forward. and that I would never associate my own success with any of my own achievements or accomplishments. That I know you're a runner. If this is like running a marathon or running a race, for me, the objective would never be to finish the line first. If it would be all about stopping and, if necessary, doubling back and picking up the people who can't themselves get across the finish line.
Thank you for sharing that. It's incredibly.
It's a lot.
No, it's an incredibly powerful story. And I'm sorry that it happened, but I'm also glad that in many ways you've been able to connect with others and be a different kind of support for others than maybe you would have otherwise been.
I think so. I hope so.
Yeah.
That's the goal.
So, Mike, you've mentioned a few times faith, and you even wanted to be a priest, right, in those early years and decided not to. I'm curious what role faith has played in your life, but specifically in how you lead.
Yeah, I thought I wanted to be a priest, just to be clear. Turns out I didn't actually want to be a priest, but I would say faith has been extremely important to me, both personally and professionally. There was a time in my own kind of faith life where I might have moved away from that a bit early in my career. Mm-hmm. Just like the mentorship stuff we talked about in a professional, I fell into a friend group that brought me back into that. Mm. And where it applies to, I don't go around talking about my faith randomly to people, but I am more than happy to talk about it when I'm ever asked about it, mm-hmm. and happy to share my thoughts about it. And I think most people who work with me or know me know it is important to me. And it's important to me because it makes all the other stuff we do, let's not kid ourselves, the insanity sometimes we feel around us in the workplace and outside of it every day, all of that can only make sense in the context of something beyond that for me. And I came back into faith not as some kind of emotional, cathartic calling back. It was a well-reasoned approach. I came back because there has to be something that is more than this. By process of elimination, before I came back there, everything, this world, is orchestrated by intelligent design. And what is that? And how do I connect to that? Those who know me know I have particular views of what that is and who that is and how that, and it does, if I'm honest, my faith life informs every aspect of my life, including my professional existence.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I'm curious how you have thought about your career in the context of all these other dimensions of your life that you care so much about, certainly your family and spending time with your daughters as they grew up. I know they're out of the house now, but over the years, how did you balance career with family? And I know you volunteer and you're with the American Heart Association, the United Way, and I know you have many other interests and obligations and responsibilities. How did you make time for it all?
If I'm honest in response to that question, I wasn't very good at it, maybe in the early 2/3 of my career.
Okay.
And I found balance in being perpetually imbalanced around that and overweighted towards the professional identity and work early on. I'm so much better at it today, but I'm still recovering. I think as most of us are.
Yeah.
What I've learned is I'm actually more effective as a leader and a contributor in the workplace when I am more balanced. And the family and faith life and recreational life and all that has some symmetry with the rest of everything. I come into work with a clearer head, clearer perspective, less reactionary ultimately to things.
Yeah.
Because I have that balance, and it's made me a better leader. It's something I'm still working on, even as I can see the clubhouse from here. But yeah.
And do you give that advice to those leaders who work with you today as they're trying to figure it out, maybe in a different season, earlier season in their life?
It's a general topic of particular interest to me. And the answer to that is yes.
Yeah.
Because when I was in the doctoral program, I did my dissertation essentially on clinical burnout. When you think about what TEAMHealth is, 16,000 clinicians, the vast majority of those in emergency medicine with a high level of burnout associated with that particular clinical discipline. This whole thing about work-life balance, personal wellness, I made it part of my academic life to understand more about that in my professional life and then apply that to my leading TEAMHealth. It's a point or topic of particular interest because there's a plague out there right now. I call it the pandemic after the pandemic.
Yeah.
And it's not just unique to TEAMHealth at all. It's universal in healthcare. Those of us who don't do clinical work have our own challenges, to your point, but I know so much more than you knew before about just the incumbent challenges of being out there and doing the clinical work now, where the work is harder than it's ever been before and what that means. So I do talk about this a lot, to your question. I try not to direct anybody to do anything. I just don't feel personally capable of telling you or anybody else what to do, but I do highlight the issues organizationally. I make sure there's top of the organization awareness about this thing around all employee wellness and burnout, but in particular our clinicians. And I think as a result of that, we have more traction around that organizationally than we've ever had before.
Mike, as you think about leadership and leaders who you admire and what you've learned over the years, what are the characteristics, would you say, give me 3, of the most effective leaders?
I think it starts with competency or capability. And maybe that's a given, but sometimes people look past that as a starting point of the conversation. So you have to be knowledgeable and good at what you do as like the starting point. And then for me, probably a sense of genuineness or authenticity as a leader. It's not been a hard thing for me personally, but I've been around people who I might describe as inauthentic. And I could never get past whatever else they brought to the table. I could never get past that.
This is a podcast about authentic leadership, so I'm so glad that's one of your 3.
And then, helpful. And then probably the third thing, and I think it's true in all vocations or industries, but it has to be especially true in healthcare, kind of this sense of compassion.
Yes.
Can never forget why we show up and what we do every day and the work we do, and we stand behind the people who are actually doing the work that matters, stuff like that. So I think competency, authenticity, and compassion.
And what do you think makes you an effective leader? What's your superpower as a leader?
I think if I was to answer that question somewhat in the third party from what I've heard from other people,
that's fair.
That's a hard question to answer.
I know.
I think probably approachability or relatability.
Yeah.
Maybe it is somewhat humble upbringing or working at the very entry level. I've seen that, and I've been where most people have been. And so I think people sense that, and allows me to feel very approachable. And then beyond that, I would say people trust me. They know I'll have their back, especially when you ask them to do tough stuff, which we are talking healthcare here, and we are talking world post-pandemic. It's been a series of tough stuff almost on a daily basis, and people know I'll have their backs.
Is there anything that you're working on? Any Achilles heel in your leadership style that you're thinking about?
You probably know this. Most people would not. Yeah, I'm an extreme introvert, on the far side of the scale on introversion. And being a leader is a public-facing role.
Yes, it is.
By definition. So over my entire career, I've had to learn to be comfortable being uncomfortable in the public-facing role.
Yeah.
That was running against the grain of my very nature. And I do okay with it. And it's ironic that I'm sitting here having a podcast. I don't need to be out front and center, right? But I've had to learn to do that, and I'm continuing to learn to be okay with that. My default coping mechanism for that is just to default back to that authenticity.
Yeah.
I just can't be what I'm not, and so I'm just going to be who I am, and fingers crossed that will be enough.
Yes. It always is enough. You're very good at it, but I know that takes a lot of energy for an introvert to be on a stage or to be among people that they don't know. And so what do you do to recharge? Like, how do you fill your cup back up?
It is emotionally exhausting to me, to be honest with you. And I do it all the time.
Yeah.
So my family's gotten used to the idea. They know that I need to recalibrate. I swear, I think I might be the kind of guy who could live in a trailer in the woods for like months at a time. If I just had the internet and my dog, I'd be good. But I need to back away. I need to disconnect, shut things down, and personally recharge and let the noise settle out of the back in the mind. Read a good book, hopefully do some physical activity or exercise or something like that. And then I find my batteries recharge and I can go back in and do it again.
Put me in, coach.
Yeah. Need a timeout here, and I'll come back in a second.
There you go. All right, Mike, this has been fabulous. We are now going to enter into lightning round, where I'm going to ask you a series of questions and you don't know what they're going to be, but you're going to give me your gut, quick answers.
Had I mentioned I'm an introvert, and maybe this is not a good thing to be doing? I don't know.
Let's
do it anyway.
You're going to go to your trailer in the woods and with your dog and spend like the next week. Okay,
Here we go.
Easy on you. Here we go. All right. If you were going to swap roles with anyone in your organization, who would it be and why?
Jody Crane, CMO, TEAMHealth.
Why?
Because he's operating at the same level I am right now. So there's part of that, a sense of familiarity and being part of the C-suite. But he's also practicing medicine all the time too. So he's doing what we do for real. So I would love to be able to do that.
Okay, guilty pleasure to unwind from work.
Game of Thrones.
Favorite all-time UK basketball player?
Rex Chapman.
Oh, I had his poster. Okay, last time you tried something new.
Surfing behind a boat.
Really?
Yeah.
You got up?
Yeah.
Nice. You didn't injure yourself.
Which is exactly why I started doing surfing, because I can't do the other stuff that you do behind boats anymore. I had to do something that was less taxing.
Yes.
And so, yeah.
Very good. Impressive. Okay, the book you are reading now.
Tuesdays with Maury. Rereading it.
That's an oldie but a goodie.
Yeah, I read it when it first came out. I'm doing this thing where I have to read 10 pages of a nonfiction book every night. So I'm recycling, and I pulled that off the shelf, and I forgot how good it really is.
Oh, you've inspired me. I may have to dust that one off.
Yeah.
What is the best book you've ever read on leadership?
Can I have two?
You can have two.
Okay. The Meaning of Life by Viktor Frankl, not specifically about leadership, but there's enough elements of the humanity of leadership inside of that you'll get it. And then The Way of the Shepherd. And I cannot remember the author's name for to save my life, but it is a book about leadership. In the same way that certain faiths have used the role of the shepherd as a metaphor for leadership, this book does the same thing. It talks about the role of a shepherd in ancient times and how the rod was that they have there, that little hooked thing that they have, how that was a rod of correction at times. It was a rod of guidance at times to keep them on a path. And then it was a rod of protection and safety to pull them out of thistles and thatches and to fight off bears and stuff. And so it uses the metaphor of a shepherd to describe how we are to take care of our sheep.
Ugh, I'm going to add those to my
great.
list. I am. What time do you wake up and how do you start your day?
The dog gets me up at about 5 to 5:30 every morning. So the first thing is taking him out. That's job number one. If I'm not catching a plane somewhere, I'm trying to work out. Then I'll jump in and find a couple emails that I probably missed from the night before, and then I'll just gear up for the day.
Okay, but importantly, you said you don't check your email until you've settled into your day, had some quiet time, maybe worked out. That, I think, is great advice.
I try to do that.
We're all a work in progress.
We're all a work in progress.
All right, we have come to the end of lightning round, so I will close out with the question that all good reporters ask, which is, is there anything more that you'd like to share?
The introvert in me says no. I think we've run through the ringer here. I'll just say, I love what you're doing here. I've listened to several of them, and I'm a subscriber, and I think you're doing great work here, and I'm learning things. So when I get up at 5:30 in the morning and I'm exercising and walking, you should know that you're in the rotation now.
Oh, wow. What an honor.
Yeah.
I'm learning a lot too. And I've learned a lot over the years from you specifically. So I'm really grateful to you for spending this time with me and sharing your backstory.
Appreciate you having me. Thank you.